Reverend Father Professor Anthony Alaba Akinwale, OP. Anthony Alaba Akinwale was born in Ebute-Metta, Lagos on June 10, 1962. He had his nursery education at Mount Carmel Nursery School, Ebute-Metta, Lagos, from 1966 to 1968. Primary education at St. Paul's Catholic School, Ebute-Metta, from 1968 to 1974. And secondary education at St. Finbar's College, Akoka, Yaba, Lagos, from 1974 to 1979. He made his first profession in the Order of Preachers on September 27, 1981, and was ordained to the Catholic priesthood on December 20, 1987. Prior to his priestly ordination, he studied philosophy at the Seminary of Saints Peter and Paul, Bodija, Nigeria, and theology at the Catholic Faculty of Theology, now known as the Catholic University of Kinshasa, in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. After his priestly ordination, he worked in the Catholic Diocese of Sokoto before proceeding to the Dominican University College in Ottawa, Canada, where he obtained his licentiate and master's degrees in theology in 1991. He obtained his Doctor of Philosophy degree in systematic theology at Boston College, United States of America, in 1996. During his doctoral studies, he began his teaching career at Boston College in 1993 and returned to Nigeria in 1996 to teach at the Dominican Institute, where he rose to become Professor of Systematic Theology in 2006. He served as Pioneer Dean of Studies from 1996 to the year 2000 and President of the Dominican Institute from 2004 to 2016. Under his leadership, the Dominican Institute received full accreditation of its philosophy program from the National Universities Commission for 2 consecutive times. Among his numerous past and present engagements, the following are listed. Past President of the Catholic Theological Association of Nigeria from 2001 to 2004. Theological Consultant at the 12th Plenary Assembly of the Symposium of Episcopal Conferences of Africa and Madagascar in the year 2000. Theological Consultant at the 13th Ordinary General Assembly of the Synod of Bishops on New Evangelization at the Vatican in 2012. A theological expert on the Nigerian Anglican Roman Catholic Commission, member of the Academic Council of Studia Gilsoniana, a journal of the International Etienne Gilson Society and the Polish Society of Thomas Aquinas since 2018. Professor Akinwale is a scholar of national and international renown and a proponent of qualitative education who has authored 3 books, The Congress and the Council Towards a Nigerian Reception of Vatican II, published in 2003, Sowing the Desert, History of the Catholic Diocese of Sokoto, published in 2014. And lastly, Charism and Contradiction, Theological Reflections on Consecrated Life, published in 2016. He is currently preparing for the publication of a book entitled In Search of Nationhood, Essays in Nigerian Politics. He has co-edited 3 books and authored over 100 academic essays and conference papers in national and international journals. His writings are on religion, philosophy, history, politics, and education. In July of 2017, Father Akinwale was appointed by the Master of the Order of Preachers to serve on the Permanent Commission for the Promotion of Intellectual Life in the Order of Preachers. The commission is composed of 9 Dominican professors chosen from around the world and advises the Master of the Order on issues relating to the Order's universities. Father Akinwale also served on the board of advisors of Nova et Vetera, an international academic journal of Ave Maria University in Florida, United States of America. He served as editor-in-chief of the Nigerian Journal of Theology from the year 2000 to 2002, and is currently a member of the board of advisors of Abuja Journal of Philosophy and Theology. He is chairman of the editorial board of Catholic Weekly Independent newspaper and an unwavering writer since 2008 of the popular and widely read weekly column, Thoughts for the Week, in the Catholic Weekly Independent newspaper of the Archdiocese of Ibadan. He also serves as member of editorial board of the Catholic Weekly Herald of the Catholic Archdiocese of Lagos. His writings have been influenced by philosophers and theologians of antiquity and of our time, such as Plato, Aristotle, Augustine of Hippo, Thomas Aquinas, John Henry Newman, Ilkonga, Karana, John Murray Tillard, and Bernard Lonergan. He has been described as a student and writer of the sapiential tradition who has had a great influence on his numerous students and mentees and those who look up to him as a disciplined, excellent, and serious scholar. His articles in religious and secular newspapers have also been analytical and intellectual expositions of both pressing and timeless issues that border on the church and society. Father Akinwale served on the planning and implementation committee of the then proposed Dominican University, a committee he chaired from 2013 to 2016. In August 2017, the Board of Trustees of the Dominican University appointed him Pioneer Vice Chancellor of the Dominican University, Ibadan, the first university of the Dominican Order in Africa. He completed his term as Vice Chancellor in August 2022 and is currently at the Department of Philosophy and Religious Studies, Faculty of Humanities, Management, and Social Sciences, Augustine University, Ilara Epe, Lagos State. On February 23, 2023, having received positive assessment of his publications from a team of chosen experts, the Master of the Order of Preachers conferred on him the academic title of Magister in Sacra Thologia, the highest academic title the order confers on its intellectuals. Professor Akinwale speaks Yoruba, English, and French, and has a reading knowledge of Latin, Greek, Hebrew, Italian, Spanish, German, and Hausa. Thank you.
Chancellor and Prior Provincial, Vice Chancellor, Dominican University, Vice Chancellor, Augustine University, accompanied by the Registrar of the same university, and who is marking his birthday today. Happy birthday, sir. Distinguished members of the academia here in the hall, distinguished audience following this program through electronic means, distinguished ladies and gentlemen. The School of Plato was given the name Academy, and the Magistral Lecture is an academic event. Yet a clarification comes to mind. Joseph Piper alerts us as to the real origin of the designation. In his essay bearing the title, "What Does Academic Mean?" Piper points out that if the School of Plato was given the name Academy, it was not because the designation had anything to do with the essence of the school. According to Piper, the reason for and the origin of the name lay in the purely spatial proximity of the school to the grove of an Athenian city hero, Academus. Considering this historical clarification, it can be said that we use the word academic in a borrowed sense. We may, at least metaphorically, speak of a school as a grove of learning, a garden, a community of knowledge and wisdom for men and women who, consistent with the nature of the human being, as a being animated by the vital principle of activity, manifest an unrestricted desire to know, a decided openness to new ideas. When Dominic of Calaroiga founded the Order of Preachers in 1216, he had in mind a community of preachers, prayerfully living, active and evolving within the proximity of the grove of knowledge that the academia is, in preparation for doctrinal preaching. This is the foundational inspiration behind the Dominican University, Ibadan, venue of this lecture. In Yoruba philosophy, ingratitude is a synonym for theft. For this reason, I cannot fail to use the opportunity of this lecture to show gratitude first to the most provident God, whose Spirit opens and enlightens our minds, and then to the Order of Preachers. I am grateful to the Master of the Order of Preachers, Father Gerard Timome, who, as 88th successor of our blessed Father Dominic, conferred on me the title of Magister in Sacra Theologia, and to Father Pablo Sekuli, his assistant for intellectual life, who reopens the dossier of my nomination after years of dormancy. I interpret their gesture as inviting and challenging me in the name of the Dominican family to spend the remaining years of my life in continued spiritual and intellectual search for the truth that is God, and to share with the order, the church, the academia, and the world at large fruits of my search, fruits of my experience of searching for truth but being found by truth. For to go in search of veritas is to come to know the truth, that the one who searches for truth does not find truth, but is found by truth. I use the opportunity of this lecture to gratefully and publicly acknowledge those who supported and continue to support and work to concretize the vision of the Dominican University from its conception and until this point in the history of the young institution. I single out for recognition Emeritus Archbishop Felix Alaba Akinwale and all who served with him on the Pioneer Board of Trustees. I recognize the presence of Archbishop Gabriel Akinwale, who now serves on the board, Professors Ibiajayi, Gosekagwere, who served on the Pioneer Governing Council, Mr. Patrick Akinwale, also member of that Pioneer Council, who is here with us today. I gratefully recognize all who are following this lecture through electronic means, a fascinating accomplishment of communication technology. I was born into the family of Daniel and Elizabeth Akinwale. My mother was a teacher by profession. My father, a teacher not by profession, but by habit and practice. Thanks to my mother, and thanks to my maternal uncle, George Okufi, I developed interest in studying and teaching. Throughout my education from nursery to tertiary and post-tertiary, I've been blessed with great teachers. I retain fond and grateful memories of all who shaped my Dominican spiritual and intellectual formation. I shall name a few of them. My novice master, Father Chukwubuike Okwechi, who is here, Professor Jude Mbukama, Bishop Ayo Maria Atoyebi, Cardinal John Onayeko, Monsignor John Aniabu, Monsignor Francis Ogumodede, who challenged us to read works of philosophers before writing any essay on them. I reiterate what I have said many times in the past, that Monsignor Aniabu inspired me to love philosophy, while Cardinal Onayeko inspired me to love theology. These were great teachers who prepared me for theological studies in Kinshasa, where I was taught by Professors Ngindu Mushete, René Diaz, Vincent Oyago, to mention but this. Kinshasa prepared me for Ottawa, where I enjoyed the intellectual privilege of being a student sponsored by the Dominican province of Canada. Studying at the Dominican University College in Ottawa gave me the privilege of being taught by Professor Jean-Marie Roger Tigard, one of the three youngest experts at the Second Vatican Council, the other two being Father Hans Kuhn, Father Joseph Ratzinger, and Benedict XVI. I had the privilege of being taught by Father Thomas Potvin, who directed my licentiate thesis, Professor Michel Bourg, who sharpened my ability to read the New Testament, and Boniface Ramsey, thanks to whom I learned to better appreciate patristic theology. They helped me to see the beauty of the habitus theologicus in the Dominican intellectual tradition. Ottawa prepared me for doctoral studies at Boston College, where I was blessed to have had Professors Charles Eflin, who directed my doctoral dissertation, Louis Roy, and Matthew Lang, who served on the dissertation board. I cannot forget Professor Brian Daly, who showed me how to read St. Augustine of Hippo, and Professor Margaret Shatkin, who introduced me to reading John Chrysostom. I have intellectually benefited from friendship with my schoolmates. Again, I cannot mention all by name. I think of Professors Maxime Allard, Khaled Anatolius, Anna Bonta Morland, Deborah Wallace Rody. Coming back to Nigeria to teach, my years at the Dominican Institute and later at the Dominican University have been enriched by my conversations with two foremost philosophers, Professors Isaac Okolo and Francis Ofo, two invaluable collaborators during my tenure as Vice Chancellor of the Dominican University. I've had students who are now teaching and who give me hope that efforts of past years will not be in vain. I look forward to attainment of greater intellectual heights by Drs. Michael Akoya, Emeka Nwosu, Joseph Akon, Patrick Akunne, Nicholas Okeke, Jean-Paul Tego, Benjamin Kwagla, Margaret Fabanite, Melchizedek Opala, John Mark Igualesi, Miss Mirabel Kenjuani, Father Marcel Aguilani, to mention of this. In theological terms, the prime mover of the Dominican University is God. But God works through secondary instruments. Professor Joseph Kenny of blessed memory was the prime instrumental and secondary cause of the Dominican University. 14 years ago, the elective provincial chapter of the province of St. Joseph the Worker nominated both of us to the Master of the Order of Preachers for the award of the academic title of Master in Sacred Theology. Father Kenny did not live to receive the title. He died in 2013 on the feast of St. Thomas Aquinas. Perhaps the date of his death is itself an academic title. Divine providence used him to conceive the idea of the rebirth of the Dominican University, the embryo out of which the Dominican University was born. At the moment Father Kenny came up with the idea of reviving the institute, he suggested that I go and pursue higher degrees in preparation for teaching at the institute. He did not just suggest, he actively liaised with the Dominican province of Canada, the province that hosted me, and finally fully financed my studies for master's and licentiate degrees at its Collège Universitaire Dominicain in Ottawa. Father Kenny assembled his friends at the University of Ibadan to serve on a project implementation committee that worked for a license of the Dominican University. His numerous contributions to the intellectual life of the Nigerian Dominican province cannot be exhaustively listed. In lieu of such a list, to Father Kenny, I now dedicate this lecture. The Book of Constitutions and Ordinations of the Order of Preachers makes it mandatory that a new Master in Sacred Theology give a public lecture. It is for me an obligation to fulfill, to an order with an intellectual mission in the church and in the world, and to the academic community as a whole. This Magistral Lecture provides me an opportunity, a rare one for that matter, to clarify the seeds in Lebanon of my reflections as an academic theologian. What are the context, circumstances, contents, and concerns of my theological reflections, past, present, and future? I must not fail to mention that one of my past students, Jean-Paul Tego, who is my professor in Cameroon, already wrote a commentary on my reflections in Christology and Responsibility, a dialogical commentary on Anthony Akinwale's conception of African theology. what are the epistemic allies sustaining my intellectual activities as a theologian? Providing answers to these and related questions is a methodological imperative to which I must respond as I fulfill the Dominican constitutional requirements. On March 29, 1996, at Boston College, I successfully defended a doctoral thesis entitled The Theology of the Passion of Christ and its Possible Relevance to Liberation Theology. In the course of doing my research and in the course of writing that thesis, I was providentially guided and assisted by many intellectually fruitful conversations with three members of my jury, Professors Charles Heflin, Louis Roy, and Matthew Lamb of blessed memory, and by my encounter with the work of their mentor, Bernard Lonergan's method in theology. Lonergan's appropriation and transposition of Thomas Aquinas made me increasingly conscious of and concerned with two exploratory questions. One, what is theology? And two, how is it done? It is important to recall what is meant by appropriation and transposition here. Lonergan had written about two operational phases of theology, namely theology in oratione obliqua, that is, theology dealing with the past by reaching up to the mind of thinkers of the past, and theology in oratione recta, that is, theology dealing with the present by using the wisdom of the past. For Lonergan, to assume the intellectual task of transposition is to contribute to the program Vetera Novis Audire et Perfitere, initiated by the encyclical Aeterni Patris of His Holiness Pope Leo XIII. In perhaps more concrete terms, transposition is about reaching up to the mind of Aquinas and importing his compelling genius to the problems of this later day. It's not a matter of simply repeating or replicating what Aquinas said in the 13th century. It's about apprehending the contents of his reflection, interpreting them, and applying them to the problems of today in a manner that is intelligible without self-incarceration in a Thomist ghetto. It's a conversational retrieval of the ideas of Aquinas in the world of our time. It is a practical appreciation of what John Henry Newman had proposed more than a century before Lonergan as theory of development of doctrine. My reflections have been shaped by my attempt to reach out not just to the thoughts of Aquinas, but to the theology of biblical and patristic authors, and by reaching out to the thoughts of philosophers like Plato and Aristotle, whose pre-Christian ideas have served as vehicles conveying the Christian tradition, and even to the minds of European and African thinkers who might not have agreed with Aquinas. I do so in the firm conviction that Aquinas would have conversed with them just as he conversed with Aristotle and Islamic philosophers, and in the hope that such conversations, like Aquinas' own conversations with philosophers who did not belong to the Christian tradition, would bear fruit. Marie-Dominique Chenot's explanation of the place of objections in Aquinas' articles provides a methodological support for this conviction and hope. Objections for Aquinas in his articles, explains Chenot, rather than represent resistance to ideas, represent instances offered to us to project ourselves into deeper knowledge. With transposition as my intent, I formulated the two exploratory questions on the notion and method of theology. Thankfully, the Dominican Institute and the Dominican University provided me with a launch pad from which I was able to devote ample time to those two exploratory questions, because there I had the privilege of developing and teaching for 21 years an undergraduate course entitled Explorations in Christian Theology, as well as a postgraduate course on Foundations of Christian Theology, two courses which turned around these two questions. Upon completion of my doctoral studies and my return to Nigeria in 1996, my participation at the annual conferences of the Catholic Theological Association of Nigeria, CATHAN, an association I had the privilege of serving as president from 2001 to 2004, further heightened my preoccupation with these two questions. I returned to Nigeria at a time our beloved country was mercilessly afflicted with and heartlessly assaulted by an extremely harsh and outstandingly pestilential military dictatorship, the worst of its kind, in an already debilitating and traumatizing history of two bouts of military rule in Nigeria. Military rule paralyzed developmental initiatives in a country that ought to be on a fast track to development. Every institution in the land got a hit. Featuring along that dictatorship on the Nigerian landscape was a Nigerian religiosity, virulent and vociferous in its emergence, serving as opium with little or no regard for right doctrine. A loud and extravagant religiosity that emphasized faith without reason, substituting reason with emotion. These two issues, the repression that came with military rule and the extravagant religiosity of which I speak, made Nigeria a veritable locus theologicus. Successive military regimes represented an upgraded continuation of disregard for due process, repression of dissenting opinions, harassment of holders of such opinions, physical elimination of some, and all of these reflected as concerns in papers presented at the annual conferences of CATHAN. The problem was not that a certain version of liberationist discourse was getting louder within the Catholic Theological Association of Nigeria. The problem was to inquire whether it was a discourse of theologians or of social scientists who happened to be interested in religion. My concern regarding this question was expressed in an essay I entitled The Jubilee Year and Theological Method. My concern that theology fulfill and not abdicate its obligation of rescuing religion from those who would make of it an opium and of taking responsibility for Christian doctrine was expressed in African theology and dogmatic responsibility for the Christian God. African theologians are rightly concerned with enculturation. In Africa's second encounter with Christianity, Christianity came wearing the garb of West European culture. It could not have been otherwise. The compelling imperative of enculturation is the transposition of the Christian faith into the here and now of our Africanness. It is to be assumed with the history and contents of Christian doctrine in mind. It ought not be assumed in a way that pays little attention to doctrines. A theological concern for enculturation does not dispense African theologians from taking responsibility, from taking doctrinal responsibility for the Christian faith. Rather, it pertains to the task of theology to explain and communicate the doctrines of Christianity within the cultural matrix of its audience. African enculturation theology's capacity to undertake this task is largely a reflection of the adequacy or otherwise of its operative notion of culture. That is why African theology needs to avoid fixation with a fixed notion of culture and recognize the dynamic character of culture. Culture is not just a product, it is a continuous process of cultivation of the human spirit of members of a racial, religious, or national community. It is the task of theology to utilize suitable modes of expression to facilitate the preaching, explanation, celebration, and living of the Christian faith. Enculturation furnishes Christianity with a proficiency of language needed to communicate its message to a given audience. The patristic authors were experts in enculturation who skillfully deployed their pre-Christian formation in rhetoric, philosophy, and law in the task of writing theological treatises and preaching the gospel. They are memory, mirror, and allies of theology today. In their lives and writings can be found a confluence of spiritual, intellectual, and pastoral concerns, corresponding to the threefold office of Christ. The spiritual concerns of theology correspond to the priestly office of Christ. The intellectual concerns correspond to the prophetic office, while the pastoral concerns correspond to the kingly office. Their patristic convergence show us that theology is ultimately doxological. A true theologian is brought to his knees in adoration of the mystery encountered in divinity. One finds a principle of enculturation in the wisdom of Thomas Aquinas when he taught that whatever is received according to the mold of the recipient. Culture, as understood here, is the mold of the audience of the preacher, the recipient of the gospel. Culture constitutes his or her first structure of understanding, to use Hans-Georg Gadamer's terms, and enables him or her to receive the gospel that is preached. Enculturation succeeds where the audience of proclamation is able to understand the preaching of the word in its own language, within its first structure of understanding, shaped by the culture in which the audience has been formed. Aquinas was himself a practitioner of enculturation in his use of the philosophy of Aristotle to elaborate his theology. He used Aristotle to make the cross of Christ speak of itself. One also finds a supporting principle in John Henry Newman's essay on the development of Christian doctrine, in which he proposes the theory that an idea, any vigorous idea, develops by interacting with previously received ideas. In this interaction, what is contained in the original idea is further unveiled for the recipient, who cannot grasp all the aspects of the idea at once. I've also been at work striving to show, pronounce, protect, and promote the academic status of theology, that is, its right to recognition within the Nigerian university system, which for decades and until recently, under the influence of the empiricist philosophy of education at the basis of university education in Nigeria, allowed the inclusion of religious studies, but not theology. This striving is represented in my essay entitled The Place of Theology in the University Curriculum. I had argued in that essay that there are three approaches to the study of religion, namely the phenomenological, the comparative, and the theological. The phenomenological engages religion as nothing but a phenomenon among other phenomena studied through the lenses of a philosopher, historian, psychologist, anthropologist, sociologist, or any other academic discipline. The comparative approach, for its part, engages religion by comparing the beliefs, practices, modes of worship of one religion with those of another religion or of other religions, with the intention of discerning their similarities and differences. The theological approach considers and utilizes the findings of the phenomenological and comparative approaches in its inquiry into the conceptual possibility of the beliefs of a religion, in this case, of Christianity. The theological approach affirms the existence of God, as Aquinas does in the Summa Theologiae, affirms that the human intellect is capable of attaining knowledge of God and knowledge of divine realities with the assistance of the light of faith. On further reflection, it became clear to me that not only theology, but the humanities as a whole were in danger of marginalization and or exclusion within the Nigerian university system. I have made this point in the marginalization of the humanities in our educational system. I had argued that an anthropological impoverishment and developmental anemia had been created by allowing the agenda for development to be shaped by economists, politicians, and military strategists. Development is thus envisioned as the maximization of pleasure through the maximization of profit, and the maximization of profit through the maximization of power. This reductionist and exclusivist vision of development nourished the imperialist mindset that led to colonialism and its prolongation in neo-colonialism, which is the exploitation of the riches of weaker or weakened countries of the global south by powerful nations of the global north. Within countries of the global south themselves, this logic also plays out. It plays out in the political history of Nigeria, where every election is a brutal, perhaps one should say bestial, contestation over who would sit in Abuja and superintend over Nigeria's oil wealth. It played itself out in the history of the Nigeria-Biafra War, a war in which both sides were willing to sacrifice innocent lives because of crude oil sitting in the belly of the Niger Delta within the area proclaimed as Biafra. It plays itself out in the politics of the component states and local government areas of Nigeria, where whoever is governor or local government chairman sits over huge budgetary allocations, out of which the people derive little or no benefits. The marginalization of humanities, in which is found the marginalization of theology, is product of an understanding of knowledge from an exclusively technocratic perspective. According to this mindset, knowledge is that which is produced to be productive. It is manifest in an expression that has gained currency in recent years. The expression to which I refer is knowledge production. This expression is contentious because knowledge is not what we produce, not what we can produce, but what we can acquire through the tedious task of tidy thinking. Nonetheless, any knowledge that is perceived as unproductive of higher economic indices, scientific and technological advancement, was to be marginalized or altogether excluded. Philosophy and theology have become major casualties in this epistemic antipathy, if not outright hostility to the humanities. The worth of a philosophy, it was said recently at a well-attended academic colloquium, is in its ability to put bread on the dining table. To this, my good friend, Professor Okpokolo, in his characteristic wit retorted, saying, if you need bread, go to the bakery. Comments such as that to which Okpokolo retorts manifest betrayal of an avoidable ignorance of division of the sciences as envisioned by Thomas Aquinas, of what John Henry Newman describes as provinces of knowledge, and of what Bernard Lonergan brilliantly explains as field, subject, and functional specializations. In terms of mode of articulation, the epistemic boundaries traced by Newman in his The Idea of a University echo Aquinas' division of sciences and prefigures Bernard Lonergan's field specialization. These three thinkers have enabled me to understand the vocation of theology in the academic community. I shall briefly examine their contribution before spelling out my understanding of what that vocation is not and of what it is. Aquinas' division of the sciences in his commentary of Boethus' De Trinitate explains that the sciences are divided into three: mathematics, physics, and theology. Of significance here is the differentiation between theoretical or speculative intellect and the practical intellect, a differentiation that is contingent on their respective finalities. From the perspective of finalities, there is a speculative intellect whose end is the truth that it contemplates, that is, truth for its own sake, while there is a practical intellect whose finality is the direction of the truth under consideration to activity, that is, truth for the sake of right action. On this, Aquinas quotes Aristotle, who asserted in the Metaphysics that the end of the speculative knowledge is truth, but the end of practical knowledge is action. It is important to bear in mind how Aquinas applies this distinction in his articulation of the nature of sacred doctrine, which includes theology. It comes in where Aquinas inquires as to whether sacred doctrine is a speculative or practical science. His response, he said, although among the philosophical sciences, one is speculative and another practical, nevertheless, sacred doctrine includes both. As God, by one and the same science, knows both himself and his works. Still, it is speculative rather than practical, because it is more concerned with divine things than with human acts. Though it does treat even of this matter, inasmuch as man is attained by them to the perfect knowledge of God, in which consists eternal bliss. In the order of speculative sciences furnished by Boethius, physics comes before mathematics. By physics, he meant what we call today the natural sciences. Physics comes before mathematics, and mathematics comes before theology. Aquinas explains this order basing his reason on Avicenna, whose position is that theology be learned after physics, because physics provides and explains the many things needed to learn metaphysics, such as generation, corruption, and motion of bodies. In addition, theology should be studied after mathematics, he said, because knowledge of metaphysics would be impossible without knowledge of physics. One needs to know the separate substances in order to know the number and disposition of the heavenly spheres, which, for Aquinas, would be impossible without the knowledge of astronomy. Knowledge of astronomy presupposes knowledge of mathematics and metaphysics. In Aquinas' division of the sciences is to be found the philosophy of education that is often overlooked, to the point of some asserting that he had no philosophy of education. But it would have been impossible to write as much as he wrote with such simplicity and profundity if he had no philosophy of education. While I do not intend to give a detailed account of what could be described as Aquinas' philosophy of education, I consider it sufficient to offer these brief remarks. For Aquinas, the human being fully realizes himself when his intellective potential is attained. In today's terms, the human being attains self-realization in education. The human being desires the good and finds fulfillment when he attains the good as understood by the intellect. The highest good is happiness, which is found not in any created good, but in God. Happiness is found in the knowledge of God, and, as has been explained, knowledge is attained in the actualization of his intellective powers. Here is an echo of Augustine's explanation that to do evil is to turn away from education. Education is the cultivation of the human intellect in order to direct the human being away from doing evil to doing good. The purpose of education is to enable the human being to work for the common good by working for his own good, and to work for his own good by working for the common good. What has just been said leads us to a brief consideration of Newman's philosophy of education, where Aquinas, following Aristotle, Ptolemy, and Boethius, divides the sciences into mathematics, physics, and metaphysics. Newman divides what he calls the vast field of knowledge into three provinces, namely knowledge of God, knowledge of the human being, and knowledge of nature. For Newman, the division of knowledge into provinces is informed by his understanding of the attributes of truth. Truth, says Newman, possesses two attributes, namely beauty and power. In the epistemic province of physical sciences, of useful knowledge, knowledge is the apprehension of truth as power, while in the province of human sciences, knowledge is the apprehension of truth as beauty. It is the desire for the power and beauty of truth that leads the one who seeks to know into the province of knowledge of God. Newman, as I earlier asserted, echoes Aquinas and anticipates Lonergan. Lonergan distinguishes three types of specialization, namely field, subject, and functional specialization. But the justification of this distinction should begin with a preface that points to his similarity and difference vis-a-vis Aquinas and Newman. With regard to similarity, in his explanation of specialization, one finds an attempt at transposition of what Aquinas does in his division of the sciences and what Newman does in its delimitation of provinces of knowledge. Nonetheless, and here is a subtle distinction, Lonergan's differentiation of specialization is not a simple replication of the methodological accomplishments of Aquinas and Newman. It is instead its particularization in theology. For while Aquinas divides the sciences and Newman divides the field of knowledge, Lonergan describes specialization within theology itself. His field specialization is the epistemic imperative of dividing and subdividing the vast field of data, what Newman had alluded to as the vast field of knowledge. It would represent the different faculties in today's universities. Within faculties are what he would call department and subject specializations. Within departments and subject specializations, there is a further distinction and separation of successive stages in the process from data to results. These are functional specialties. My search for answers to the two questions, what is theology, how is it done, has been principally but not solely guided by Thomas Aquinas. This is in agreement with the Second Vatican Council, which counsels that the student of theology is to be introduced to the subject with Aquinas as teacher. For Aquinas, the principal task of theology is to elaborate a discourse on God, Sermon de Deo. Theology is a science that speaks about God. Its task is to name God, as Aquinas would say. But its notion of theology does not exclude treatment of other subject matters in theology. It can be said that the principal task of theology is to name God in a manner that is intelligible and coherent. Other matters, when treated by theology, are treated with reference to God as the beginning and end. In other words, while theology's principal task is to reflect on God, theology cannot fail to reflect on themes like Christology, theological anthropology, ecclesiology, sacramentology, eschatology, women's issues, politics, economic development, and the environment. But theology reflects on these under the formal aspect of God. When it does not, it ceases to be theology. It loses its character when it loses sight of its principal task. The problems of the day and a desire to elaborate a theology that is relevant make it attractive to want to elaborate a practical theology, that is, a theology that would provide technical solutions to economic, social, and political problems of the day. But this is not the task of theology. No doubt, theology must confront problems not only of the past, but also of the present. Theology must not forget the past, but must not be frozen in the past. Neither must it be fixated and obsessed with the present. But there is a caveat. It does not belong to the academic province of theology to prefer technical solutions. Now, theology will go chop. The question is sometimes asked with cynicism. But while theology does not put bread on the dining table, as some would like, it provides food for thought by proffering existential solutions needed to motivate those who would search for and apply technical solutions in matters that relate to food production. Theology brings God into the picture and into the arena where experts search for technical solutions. The theologian plays the role of a biblical prophet, not reigning as king, but providing in the name of God, that is, having listened to God, providing a necessary critique and guidance needed by those who reign as king. The global community's utter amazement at the accomplishments, and they are indeed numerous and wondrous, of science and technology has led to the attribution of paradigmatic and imperial status to mathematical and empirical sciences. We live in what I have referred to as a STEMocratic dispensation, an academic regime dictated by a preferential option for STEM courses. Are God and or any religion based on empirically unverifiable articles of faith still relevant if, during the global lockdown occasioned by the COVID-19 pandemic, places of prayer and worship were on lockdown, while hospital and laboratories, shrines of science and medical technology remained open? Are priests, pastors, and prophets still relevant if, at the time they appeared to be idle during the lockdown, scientists were at work searching for a cure or a vaccine? My response to these questions is that the humanities, religion, and theology situate us in the sapiential realm of meaning. Without the meaning they offer to existence, motivation to look for a cure in the realm of technique would have been wanting or at least deficient. Moreover, modern physicists like Gerhard Schroeder are echoing the ancients on the relationship between physics and metaphysics. Schroeder's works represent a not unsuccessful attempt at synergistic alliance between theology and physics, theology and the natural sciences. He identifies 4 basic forces that govern the physical interactions of all matter, namely gravity, electromagnetic force, and the strong and weak nuclear bonds, as pointing to the unified order in the universe. These 4 basic forces account for the fact that we have a user-friendly universe filled with order and stability, and in at least one location, life conscious of its own existence. He argues that the statement in Genesis chapter 1 verse 31, and God saw all that had been done, and behold, it was very good, nuances what is learned from physics regarding this ordered unity. To buttress his argument, he refers to Aramaic translation of this verse by the sage Onkelos. According to Onkelos, this verse would read in Aramaic, quote, and behold, it was a unified order. There is thus a biblical allusion to the unification of the 4 basic forces, a unification whose demonstration is beyond the reach of technology as foreseen. There is, he says, consensus between biblical theology and physics that there is a unified and ordered universe. Explaining what he calls the physics of metaphysics, Schroeder wrote, I quote, "The physical world is a wonder-filled phenomenon of unity. The same laws that govern the 10,000 billion stars distributed among the 100 billion galaxies of our universe, stretching over some 15 billion light years of space, also govern chemical reactions within the 0.001 centimeter of a cell. From the 10 raised to the power of -5 meters of an organic cell to the 10 raised to the power of 26 meters of the universe, from the mass of an atom, 10 raised to the power of -26 kilograms, to the mass of the sun, 10 raised to the power of 30 kilograms, with one set of laws. Why? It didn't have to be this way. Why is the universe so intelligible, so consistent? Science alone cannot say. Perhaps we're encountering a hint of the metaphysical held within the physical. Schroeder believes the Big Bang gave birth to a universe of undifferentiated unity, whose oneness science is struggling to rediscover, insofar as science is still trying to explain what gave birth to the Big Bang. The unified order engendered by the Big Bang raises a philosophical problem of beginning, which the laws of physics have not and will not be able to resolve. If the Big Bang explains the beginning of the universe, to attempt to use the laws of physics to explain the Big Bang would suggest that the laws of physics existed before the physical material it was to regulate. There would then be physics without the physical, which would be bizarre. But, as bizarre as it sounds, it points to another consensus between physics and biblical theology. It is a consensus on eternity. In the trajectory of the position of Schroeder, therefore, there has been a movement from the observation and recognition of a unified order generated by the Big Bang to the philosophical problem of a beginning and to the affirmation of eternity. I have taken time to present Schroeder's findings in physics because they lead to the conclusion that in fulfilling its principal task of speaking about a God whom no one has ever seen, theology has an ally in modern science. As I conclude this lecture, I reiterate that academic theology is not to be confused with populist preaching in contemporary Nigerian religiosity. A religiosity which, alongside crude oil, movies, music, and footballers, Nigeria is exporting in a phenomenally high proportion to the rest of Africa and beyond, to non-Africans and to Africans in diaspora. In speaking of academic theology, I have identified 3 modes of academic engagement with religion, namely the phenomenological, the comparative, and the theological. The theological approach includes and embraces the phenomenological and comparative approaches, but does so within the horizon of faith and reason. That is why philosophy and theology cannot be separated. Its task is to establish the intelligibility, coherence, and relevance of faith. It does this for and within the church, for the academia, and the society. The task of academic theology, which presupposes faith, needs to be assumed in order to detoxify religion and speak for religion. Academic theology detoxifies by ensuring that religion is not reduced to uncritical emotional outbursts of fanaticism and fundamentalism. The task of theology is multiple. But even in this multiplicity, there is unity, in the sense that there is a principal and unifying task. That principal task is to speak of God. It unifies all the other tasks of theology in the sense that when theology speaks of other things, it does so, as Aquinas clarified, in their relation to God as the beginning and end. The integrity of the human person is violated when existence is seen exclusively in terms of techniques. The human person exists in a natural habitat of relationships, and the human person and its relationships are sustained by meaning. The human person remains miserable without meaning and is compelled to search for this meaning. This is the office of the wise man, as Aquinas would say. In the absence of meaning, motivation to search for techniques is either seriously eroded or totally absent. The search for meaning is the desire to apprehend the intelligibility of the universe, and this search for intelligibility raises the question of God. The human intellect is naturally programmed to search for meaning, for the intelligibility of the universe. For this reason, exclusion or undue restriction of the cognitional exercise of searching for meaning from the academia violates the integrity of education, the integrity of the human person, and is detrimental to the search for authentic development. Violation of the integrity of education exposes us to insecurity in a world of science without conscience, a world that ironically would be in a clear and present danger of annihilation by its own accomplishments. The immensely precious intellectual output of Plato's school in the grove of Academos bears eloquent testimony to what the human spirit can accomplish when it is allowed to think freely. The university is a place where questions are freely raised by questing spirits. Answers are proffered. Answers proffered are placed under further scrutiny, leading to further questions and answers in the endless turn of the wheel of knowledge. To be otherwise is to halt the wheel of knowledge, and to halt the wheel of knowledge is to build a city of arrested development, because the city itself is inhabited by citizens of arrested development. The task of theology is to contribute to authentic development of the human person, which is not the same as proffering technical solutions, by preserving the integrity of education, by undertaking and sustaining an academic search for meaning. Theology does this by raising and addressing the question of God. That is why its task is multiple, even as God is its subject matter. But Christian theology does not just raise the question, it presents the answer of the Christian tradition and proceeds to demonstrate the intelligibility, coherence, and pertinence of its answers. Theology is not to be done in isolation. The task of academic theology is undertaken with allies. In this respect, the traditional tools of theology are well known. Scripture, described as the soul of theology, the patristic texts and history of doctrine, which I will describe as memory of theology, philosophy, which I will describe as its intellect, the social sciences, which ensure its mobility, that is, its ability to communicate, and the culture and religious anthropology of the audience, which provide a language of communication. Other academic disciplines enable theology to know the audience of its discourse. That is why theology needs human, social, and natural sciences. It is consistent with the relationship between the sciences, as outlined by Aquinas in his discussion on the method and division of the sciences. It is also in line with the collaborative venture of education envisioned by Newman in his discourses on the idea of a university, and by Lonergan in his discussion of specializations. The enumeration of theology, of allies of theology, which I have just undertaken, underscores the imperative of academic independence and interdependence. This academic interdependence is exemplified in the relationship between philosophy and theology. While one may differentiate between the two, they are not to be separated. And that they are not to be separated explains why the theologian must also be a philosopher. Philosophy, which is use of the natural light of reason, is the search for knowledge. In the search for knowledge, is to be differentiated from theology, which depends on the light of faith. Theology is a necessary rational inquiry into the truths of faith by way of a collaborative cognitional exercise between faith and reason. A corollary to this position of Thomas is his position on the relationship between grace and nature. Grace and nature are not in opposition, says Thomas. Rather than being in opposition, grace heals, elevates, and perfects nature, so that nature is enabled to attain its supernatural goal. In promoting the use of philosophy in theology, Aquinas makes a strikingly graphic statement, enriched with Christological reference, saying, I quote, "A mixture is not thought to have occurred when one of two items comes into the possession of the other, but when both of them are changed in their nature. So, those who use the works of the philosophers in sacred doctrine, by bringing them into the service of faith, do not mix water with wine, but rather change water into wine. The philosopher does not put food, does not put bread at the table, but changes water into wine. The theologian rather. But theology is not a merely academic exercise. It is an intellectual exercise that is interwoven with a spiritual quest which expresses itself in conversion. The theologian encounters the mystery of God, and this brings the theologian to his or her knees. It is what I call the doxological vocation of the theologian under the influence of Gregory and Chancellor. That informs the submission in my essay, Theology of Conversion and Conversion of Theology. The need for conversion to God, expressed in the Dominican spirituality of mutual inclusion of the intellectual quest for truth, is expressed in the Dominican spirituality of mutual inclusion of the intellectual quest for truth and the spiritual quest for God. Aquinas exemplified this by following the example of the patristic authors, particularly Augustine of Hippo. As I said in my Val McInnes Chairholders Lecture at the Pontifical University of St. Thomas Aquinas in Rome last year, theology in the Dominican tradition has a role to play in this regard. The role of a Dominican faculty of theology is to serve as mirror and memory of this role of every faculty of theology. It must, within the Dominican tradition of Sed Veritas, foster a contemplative, spiritual, and intellectual interaction with the gospel of Jesus Christ, undertake research into the intelligibility and coherence of Catholic doctrine in a dialogue of faith and reason, religion and science, the gospel and culture, in the search for meaning and for solutions to existential problems in the university's milieu and in the pastoral activities of the church in the world. The task that is set for the Faculty of Theology makes it imperative for theology to listen to the findings of all other academic disciplines and utilize them in its own academic pursuits. The spiritual ground on which education stands is spared the danger of erosion and or total collapse when theology guards religion from the impurities of sacralism, thus enabling religion to provide a direction for ethics as humanity expands the frontiers of technology. The illusion that science and technology alone will solve all the problems we face in human civilization has been shattered by the helplessness of humanity during the COVID-19 pandemic. Here in Nigeria, it has been shattered by the disputed outcome of the 2023 elections, despite the deployment of beavers. It shows us that there is danger in technique without ethics. In my Arometa philosophy of education, I have argued that education must reflect the intellectual, technical, and ethical needs of the human person. That education is a tripod of intellectual, technical, and ethical formation standing on the ground of spiritual formation. That since a tripod can only stand on 3 feet, if any of the 3 feet were to be paralyzed or amputated, the tripod would lose its balance and collapse. And that if the spiritual ground were to be undercut, it would not be possible for education to stand. The spiritual dimension in man is a desire for the infinite which expresses itself in religion. But religion here is not to be understood in the limited sense of rituals performed in the church or mosque or shrine. When thousands of football fans gather at Wembley Stadium or Old Trafford and are singing their hearts away, that is the religion of today. The stadium has become the basilica, and there is even an entrance hymn as the players march onto the field. And whoever has had the privilege of sitting beside the Nigerian Football Supporters Club, the privilege I had in 1994 when Nigeria played the World Cup matches in Boston, you would have noticed that what they do comes very close to being liturgical. Religion, as Paul Tillich said, was my master before my intellectual conversion to Thomas and the Church Fathers. He said, whatever preoccupies the human person in an ultimate and absolute manner is religion. For Christian theology, this ultimate preoccupation of the human spirit is God, about whom theology speaks. Thank you for your patient attention.
That lecture is indeed worthy of a round of applause.